Welcome to Education 101. My name is Katia Prince, and this presentation is on learning from multimedia lessons. The objective of this presentation is to learn about the multimedia principle and why this principle should be used in multimedia lessons. I will also cover the modality principle, its limitations, and when it should be applied. As it pertains to learning processes, in a nutshell, people learn through two channels, words and images. This dual channel theory suggests that people process auditory and visual stimuli separately. Each channel requires time to process information before merging into a cohesive cognitive concept. But it is important to remember that people can process only a few pieces of information in each channel at one time. Based on this dual channel theory, some key principles in designing multimedia materials were developed. Today, we're going to cover two learning principles as they relate to multimedia presentations. It is recommended that multimedia include words and graphics rather than words alone. This principle is known as the multimedia principle, and it states that people learn better from words and pictures than they do from words alone. Now, words can be printed on the screen for people to read, or they can be spoken so people can listen through earphones or speakers. In terms of graphics, you can use static illustrations such as drawings, charts, graphs, maps, and photos, or dynamic illustrations like animation and video. So why words and graphics? The rationale for the multimedia principle is that people are more likely to understand material when they engage in active learning. Using words alone may result in shallow learning because the learner is not connecting the words with other knowledge. Multimedia presentations, on the other hand, engage learners in active learning because an important part of active processing is to mentally construct visual and verbal representations of the material and mentally process them. For example, the picture of an apple coupled with the word apple equals better understanding. And that is the premise of the multimedia principle. In e-learning courses, it is better to use words and pictures together. Not just a picture without the word, since the information may be misinterpreted. Now, while graphics can boost learning, it is also important to select the kind of graphic that is congruent with the text and with the learning goal. Let's consider several possible functions of graphics. So you have decorative graphics, which are visuals that are good for appeal. A good example are flowers. You have representational graphics, which illustrate the appearance of an object. For example, a USB. You have your transformational graphics, which illustrate changes in time or over space. The time-lapse animation of seed germination pictured on this particular slide is a good example. You have interpretive graphics. These are the visuals that make intangible phenomenon visible and concrete. So drawings of molecular structures would be a good example. You also have organizational graphics that show relationships among content, specifically qualitative relationships. A matrix such as this table that we're looking at here is a good example of organizational graphics. And lastly, you have your relational graphics, which actually summarize quantitative relationships. So a bar graph or a pie chart are a good example of relational graphics. A key concept to remember about graphics is that they actually depress learning if they are irrelevant or gratuitous. If you include a photo which doesn't relate to the text, then the learner starts devoting some of their limited processing capacity to working out the link between the photo and what it is that you're trying to convey. Now, this tends to happen when you know you should add a picture, but can't quite find the right one, so you settle for something less. Now, this actually reduces the effectiveness of the presentation. So no eye candy or graphic that simply has absolutely nothing to do with the material that you're presenting. So we just discussed the value of adding visuals and the appropriate visuals that promote learning. We also discussed that visuals must be accompanied with words to promote learning, and that words can be in printed text or spoken words. So, in terms of the words that are used with corresponding visuals, does it matter if those words are represented as printed text, that is, on-screen text, or spoken text, that is, a narration? Well, it does. The modality principle suggests that we put words in spoken form rather than printed form. The rationale is that learners may experience an overload of their visual channels when they must simultaneously process graphics and the printed words that refer to them. Now, even though the modality principle states that you should always use sound, there are exceptions. Some things to consider are the technical demands that the learning environment cannot meet. Things like sound cards, headsets. Also, using sound may be expensive. There are times when the words should remain available for memory support. For example, a mathematical formula may be part of an audio explanation, but because of its complexity, it should remain visible on the screen too. Also, keywords that identify the steps of a procedure should be presented by on-screen text. Another common example involves the directions to a practice exercise. And lastly, it's good to keep in mind that sound will not work for those with disabilities, so it's best to know your learners so that you can make the decision of whether or not to use text along with the graphics. So with that said, when does the modality applies? The modality principle does not mean that you should never use printed text. When preparing a multimedia lesson, apply the principles in ways that are consistent with the way that the human mind works. The modality principle always applies in situations in which you present graphics and their verbal commentary at the same time, and the material is complex and presented at a rapid pace. Now, in addition to those instances that are presented in the last slide, modality principle applies when the learner is not a native speaker of the language, or the learner is extremely unfamiliar with the material, but also use common sense. If learning is more effective in both printed and spoken words for the particular multimedia lesson that you're putting together, simply use it. So in multimedia lessons, remember that words, whether written text or spoken along with graphics, allow learners to engage in learning and equals better understanding. And that it is best to use spoken words with graphics when the words and graphics are being presented together and the material is complex and presented at a rapid pace. That's all, folks. Thank you.